We now have the keys that are necessary to start to systematically unveil the Bible's chronology. The first two keys revealed the divinely ordained blueprint or framework for time, which governs the progression of God's plan. Keys 1 and 2 basically say that the blueprint is a week of 7 days of 1,000 years each. The next two keys resulted in the discovery of God's redemption chronology, which exists alongside the Bible's actual chronology. Key 3 says, at the end of every Jubilee cycle of 49 actual years, God adds a special 50th year of grace. This must be a measurement in the redemption chronology. Key 4 is the principle of unreckoned time, which says that God does not count times when his people's sin causes his plan of redemption to be suspended. This is convincingly revealed by the 479 completed years recorded in 1 Kings 6:1, which are 131 years short of the actual time. Now, the total times of servitude are also 131 years. So if they are subtracted from the total time, this gives exactly 479 years. The only alternative to this solution is to force the periods in Judges and Acts 13:20, which add up to 610 years, to fit into the 479 years of 1 Kings 6:1. This involves torturing the scriptures. On the other hand, when the key of redemption chronology with its unreckoned times is accepted, there is a perfect harmony of all the stated times. Again, this requires the existence of a separate redemption chronology, in which the years out of fellowship are not counted. These latter keys define how time is reckoned on the redemption chronology. They are like counting the number of days of pay owed to an employee. Weekends are not reckoned because work is suspended then. That's key 4. But bank holidays, which are like jubilees, are added as extra days, even though no work was done. Hence they are days of grace. And this corresponds to key number 3. So whereas keys 1 and 2 define the structure of time that governs the redemption chronology, keys 3 and 4 tell us how redemption time, as counted by God, relates to actual time, as counted by man. This is important because the progression of time within God's overall blueprint is according to redemption time, not actual time. We're now going to study the period of time from Abraham's birth to the Exodus. The story of Israel starts with the birth of Abraham. God chose him out of the nations to be the father of his chosen nation, through whom he would reveal his plan of redemption. God had originally spoken to him in Ur of the Chaldeans, and called him to leave his family and to go to Canaan. Let's read Genesis 12, 1-3. It says, "Now the Lord had said to Abram, 'Get out of your country and from your family and your father's house to a land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.'" He left Ur, but he was only partially obedient, for he took his father Terah and Lot with him, and instead of going to Canaan, they settled in Haran, probably because of his father Terah. Now in Genesis 11:31 we read, "And Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. And they came to Haran and dwelt there." So, instead of obeying God, although they set out to go to the promised land, they actually stopped and lived in Haran instead. Only years later did Abram obey God's call to go to Canaan. We read about that in Genesis 12:4 and 5. So, at last, Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Then Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. This happened when Terah died, as Stephen in Acts 7 confirms this order of events in Acts 7 verses 2 to 4. He says, "The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran, and said to him, 'Get out of your country and from your relatives, and come to a land that I will show you.' Then came he out of the land of the Chaldeans," that's from Ur, "and dwelt in Haran. Then after some years, from there, when his father was dead, he moved into this land, into the land of Canaan, in which you now dwell." Abram was now 75, according to Genesis 12:4. As soon as Abram obeyed and entered Canaan, the Lord appeared to him and promised him the possession of the land. That's in Genesis 12:7. Thus God entered into covenant and made promise to Abram when he was 75. This was the start of his sojourning in a strange, that is, a foreign land. This sojourning is described in Exodus 12, verse 40 and 41. Which says, "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day, it came to pass that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt." This gives the time of their sojourning until the Exodus, when Israel became a nation in her own right, as 430 years. Egypt is mentioned because part of this period was spent dwelling in Egypt. In fact, we shall see that their sojourning was in two equal parts. For the first 215 years, they were traveling nomads, mainly in the land of Canaan. They then entered Egypt because of the famine, and they dwelt there for a further 215 years. After Joseph died, they increasingly came under Pharaoh's oppression. This was ended by the Exodus, when the nation was born. The total time, then, of their sojourning, being strangers in a foreign land, was 430 years. Logically, this time of sojourning of God's people in a foreign land started when Abraham left his homeland and entered Canaan when he was 75. A deduction often made from Exodus 12:40 is that the total time spent in Egypt alone was 430 years, but it does not say that. At best, it is a possible interpretation of the words, but a more natural reading is that the sojourning, which started with Abraham and continued when they settled in Egypt, ended after exactly 430 years with the exodus out of Egypt. The reason Egypt is given a special mention as part of the sojourning is in order to connect it with the exodus out of Egypt, which brought this time of sojourning to an end. Moreover, both the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint, that is, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, are more explicit. They put it like this: "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel and of their fathers, which they sojourned in the land of Canaan and in the land of Egypt, was 430 years. Also Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, confirms this interpretation. He says this: "They, that is the Israelites, left Egypt in the month of Xanthicus, on the 15th day of the lunar month, 430 years after our forefather Abraham came into Canaan, but 215 years only after Jacob removed into Egypt." We shall see that his division of this time into two halves of 215 years is accurate. that this time period of 430 years leading up to the Exodus actually started from when Abraham entered Canaan and received the covenant promise from God is confirmed absolutely, beyond doubt, by Paul in Galatians 3:16 and 17. This is what he says. Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He does not say, and to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to your seed, who is Christ. And this I say, that the law, which was 430 years later, cannot annul the covenant that was confirmed before by God in Christ, that it should make the promise of no effect. Now, the law was given at Sinai, in the same year as the Exodus. So this tells us that the Exodus was 430 years after the promise was given to Abraham, when he entered the land of Canaan at the age of 75. Genesis 12:4 says, So Abraham was 75 when the promise was made to him. The law was given 430 years afterwards, according to Galatians 3:17, so the Exodus also took place 430 years afterwards. And that's what Exodus 12:40 said. This gives a total of 75 plus 430 years, making 505 years from Abraham's birth to the Exodus. Now, we know this should be a 490-year Great Jubilee Cycle. However, we seem to have 505 years, which is 15 years too many. Are there 15 unreckoned years to be found in this period? We're now going to see that there were, in fact, exactly 15 years from Ishmael's conception to Isaac's birth. God promised Abraham a son who would inherit the promises of the covenant, but Abraham, in an attempt to make God's promise come true in the flesh, tried to help God by having a son by Hagar, Sarai's maid. And Ishmael was conceived as a result. He was conceived, as we're going to see now, when Abraham was 85. This was 10 years after they entered the land. Genesis 16, verse 3 and 4, it says, Sarai, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abraham had dwelt in 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abraham to be his wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. Now Abraham was 75 when he entered the land. Therefore Ishmael was conceived 10 years later, and therefore Abraham was 85 when this happened. He disobeyed God in this, and tried to fulfill God's purpose in his own way, in his own strength. Eventually, of course, he got back in faith and trusted God to miraculously produce his promised son Isaac through Sarah. By moving in the flesh, he delayed God's redemptive purposes. Let's see now when Isaac was born. How long was this delay? Genesis 21 verse 5 says that Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born. Now Abraham sinned through unbelief and conceived Ishmael when he was 85. Isaac was born when Abraham was 100. Therefore Isaac was born 15 years after Abraham sinned. That's 100 minus 85 is 15 years. And so this accounts for the 15 unreckoned years. The importance of these events is due to their connection with the coming of the Messiah, through whom redemption would be accomplished. Bible history and its chronology is centered on the messianic seed line, as God works to bring forth his Messiah. So if anything affected a person on this line, it affected the whole plan of redemption. God had promised Abraham that the Messiah would be his seed. God also ordained that he would have a son by Sarah, by a supernatural birth, so that this son would be a type of Christ, and that the Messiah would come through this son, through Isaac. And the Messiah too would have a supernatural birth, just like Isaac. You see, Isaac was God's choice, and God could only forward his plan of redemption through Isaac. So when Abraham tried to fulfill God's plan himself in the flesh, he was substituting the work of God, the work of the Spirit through promise, with a work of the flesh, with Ishmael. God could not accept Ishmael as the messianic seed, but for 15 years Ishmael occupied the place of the promised seed Isaac. So redemption time was suspended until Isaac, the true seed of promise, was born. So for 15 years, Isaac's birth was delayed, and as a result, God's redemption program was suspended by this work of the flesh, because redemption could only come through Isaac. When Isaac, the chosen seed, was born, the redemption clock could restart. Therefore, these 15 years are unreckoned time. So, from Abraham's birth to the Exodus, there were 505 years, but 15 of them were unreckoned, leaving 505 minus 15, that is, 490 years. Again, a perfect forgiveness cycle. These 15 years fall outside the 490-year cycle because they can form no part of the plan of redemption, so they're unreckoned. God used the chronology to clearly mark these 15 years as an interruption of the 490-year cycle, so that we would understand the true nature of what was going on, and that God cannot use man's fleshly efforts to forward his purposes. They get in the way. They hinder and delay his work. Following the flesh may often seem to be the easy or convenient way, offering quicker results, but actually they're just temporary. But it actually means that you're doing it alone, rather than in partnership and fellowship with God. Even if God's way seems to take longer, you will always get there first if you follow it. This has a clear application to our own lives. God marked this era of Abraham in the Bible chronology for us to learn from it. Our attempts to fulfill God's plan in the flesh, because we do not trust him to fulfill his promise, will only get in the way, will only hinder and delay what God wants to do in and through our lives. When we intrude our flesh, our efforts, opinions, our plans into his work, he does not accept it. It can form no part of his work, and he has nothing to do with it. So don't rush ahead of God to help him. Trust his word, and he will bring it to pass. The time that you spend trying to do God's work in your own strength is unreckoned as far as he is concerned. So don't try and manipulate circumstances like Abraham did, trying to fulfill God's promises by yourself. Seek God as your only source. Depend on the power of his Spirit. God clearly marked these 15 unreckoned years by excluding them from his redemption chronology. The Bible also marks them by the way that the biblical account between the end of Genesis 16 and the start of Genesis 17 jumps over this unreckoned time. Thus, Genesis 16 ends by saying, Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. That's verse 16. Then Genesis 17 starts with, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram. Notice the Bible largely jumps over this period, for nothing significant happened. God has nothing to say about it, for it contributed nothing to his plan. This silence indicates Abram was not hearing from heaven and not moving forward with God because he was in disobedience. That is the result of following the flesh. Since Abraham was God's representative and he was out of fellowship for 15 years, this sin delayed God's plan for 15 years. The fact he was still out of fellowship at the end of this time is evident from what God says to him in Genesis 17:1. He says, when Abraham was 99 years old. Now 99 signifies he had reached the end of his doing it in his own strength. For 9 is the final digit, is the number of finality. And so 99 signifies the fact that he had reached the end of his own strength. And at this point the Lord appeared to Abraham and said to him, I am Almighty God. This is El Shaddai, the God who is more than enough, the God whose strength is perfected in your weakness. He said, I am Almighty God, walk before me. That is, walk with me, get back in fellowship with me, follow my lead. Look to me for the answer, trust in my power to do it. he says. Walk before me and be blameless. In other words, stop leaning on the flesh now. Well, near the end of these 15 years, God therefore appeared to Abraham and rebuked him for looking to himself and not to him, not to God, not to the one who was well able to give him a son. And so God, at this time, called him back into fellowship, commanding him to walk before him again, promising him, giving him a wonderful promise, in fact. He said, "And I will make my covenant between me and you and multiply you exceedingly." In other words, he was saying, I will do it, Abraham. Trust in me. And in response, Abraham repented and surrendered to God's will. That's in verse 3. It says, Abraham fell on his face and God talked with him. And then it says that fellowship was restored. And the result was God blessed him, changing his name from Abram to Abraham, meaning the father of many nations. You can read about that in verse 4 to 6. Actually, it's interesting that the extra H inserted in the middle of his name, and also the same happened for Sarai, who was changed to Sarah, is the sound of a breath, the Ruach, the breath of God, signifying the infusion of God's Spirit, grace, and power into their beings, enabling them to be fruitful. God promised then that Isaac would be born that time next year to Sarah, and that's in verses 15 to 21. Abraham now started to trust God to fulfill his promise concerning his promised seed, Isaac, and that's given a great description in Romans 4, 16 to 21. And this birth of Isaac is the key to God's plan of redemption moving forward again. So, when Abraham got back into fellowship with God and trusted in his promise, God could work again in his life to bring the promise of Isaac into manifestation. At the moment, we are only calculating biblical events to their year. Although it's worth pointing out that in many cases the Bible tells us the actual day when an event happened. This is because of the precision of his cycles and his keeping of appointments on time and his use of feasts that are based on the position of the moon, which can be astronomically calculated. Exodus 12:41 is an example of the Bible's precision, even to the very day. It says, "And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the self-same day it came to pass, that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt." This shows that God's people kept accurate records of time, enabling them to make such a statement. Moreover, the fact that the Exodus took place on the very same day as when Abraham entered the Promised Land indicates that both of these major events took place on an important feast day, as indeed many divinely appointed events do. In this way, we can understand how they noticed that the Exodus happened on the anniversary of Abraham's entry into the land. Now, we can demonstrate the Bible's perfect accuracy over this period. Previously, we showed that Abraham's birth must have happened on the opening day of the new redemption cycle, which was on Tabernacles, the 15th day of the 7th month. We've seen that the length of the cycle from his birth to the Exodus is exactly 505 years. And the time from his entry into the land to the Exodus is exactly 430 years. Therefore, the time from his birth to the entry into the land must have been exactly 75 years. In other words, he entered the land on his 75th birthday, which was therefore the 15th day of the 7th month, which is Tabernacles. It was indeed a feast day. This raises another apparent contradiction, which has a wonderful resolution that is important in reconstructing the Bible's chronology to the day. If Abraham, you see, entered the land at the Feast of Tabernacles, that's the 15th day of the 7th month, then the Exodus, exactly 430 years later, must have been also at Tabernacles. Yet it is well known that it took place at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is on the 15th day of the first month. The solution is the calendar change that God instituted 2 weeks before the Exodus as the new month was beginning. We read in Exodus 12, 1 and 2, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you." Often, a new dispensation is marked by a change of calendar. In this case, the change was in the start of the year, moving from the autumn to the spring. The original lunisolar calendar, which would have started after the flood, had its first month in the autumn. This makes sense, for this is when the agricultural year began, and originally farming provided the main need for a calendar. This is confirmed by the ancient Giza calendar, which started in the autumn. It reads, 2 months gathering, that's September, October, 2 months planting, November, December, 2 months late sowing, that's January, February, 1 month cutting flax, that's March, 1 month reaping barley, that's April, 1 month reaping and measuring grain, that's May, 2 months pruning, that's June, July, 1 month summer fruit, that's August. So originally the year began around the autumn harvest and the start of the rainy season, both of which signified the start of a new agricultural year. This means the Exodus, which happened in the spring, would have been in the 7th month. So the Exodus did take place on the 15th day of the 7th month of the original lunisolar calendar. But as this 7th month was beginning, God instructed Moses to call it the first month instead, so that from now on the new year for Israel would be in spring. This signified that the Exodus was a brand new start for God's people, the beginning of Israel's life as a nation, and from now on, every time that they started a new year, the first thing they remembered and celebrated through the main feast of the first month was their redemption from slavery at the Exodus. This connects also with the second purpose of this calendar change. It allowed for the introduction of the full set of feasts throughout the year in such a way that as Israel kept them in their correct order and at their appointed times, starting in the first month, they acted out a prophetic picture of what the Messiah would do and when he would do it. Thus, he would fulfill the plan of redemption in stages, first the feasts in the first month, and so on. This required the institution of a ceremonial year that started in the spring. Even so, there are remnants of the original autumnal year in the Bible and in Jewish tradition and practice. Jewish tradition says creation took place on the 1st of Tishri, which is now the 7th month. Most obviously, the first day of Tishri, that is the first day of the 7th month, is the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, literally the beginning of the year. Now we can understand this strange idea. Mishnah Rosh Hashanah 1:1 says, the 1st of Tishri is the beginning of the year for years, sabbatical cycles and the Jubilee. Exodus 23:16 says that the harvest feast of tabernacles in the 7th month occurs at the going out of the year. Likewise, Exodus 34:22 says this feast is at the turn of the year. Later, we will see that for the kings who reigned from Jerusalem, their regnal years started in Tishri, not Nisan. Moreover, in the evening after the Exodus, on the 15th day of the first month in the new calendar, but of course the 15th day of the 7th month in the old one, it says that Israel camped in Sukkoth. That's in Numbers 33, 3-5. Now, Sukkoth means booths or tabernacles, the very name of the feast of the 7th month. So at the Exodus, God saw Israel as fulfilling the feast of the 7th month, even though he had made it the first month to them. As they were fulfilling the Feast of Unleavened Bread on the new calendar, which is from the 15th day of the first month for a week, they were also fulfilling the Feast of Tabernacles on the old calendar. That's the 15th day of the 7th month for a week. Leviticus 23, verse 42 and 43 confirms this. This all confirms that the first month of Exodus 12:2 was originally the 7th month. That a 6-month calendar change happened at some time is well accepted. But now, through tracing the precise chronology of the Bible, we can understand exactly what happened. Abraham was born on the 15th day of the 7th month, and he entered the land on the 15th day of the 7th month on his 75th birthday. And the Exodus took place exactly to the day 430 years after that, again on the 15th day of the 7th month. But at that time, God changed the calendar so that the 7th month became the 1st month, making the Exodus to be the 15th day of the 1st month on the new calendar. I hope you're gaining an appreciation of the precision and the perfection of the Bible's chronology. God initiated his covenant with Abraham, which included the Promised Land, when he was 75, but he could not possess his inheritance immediately. Instead, he and his seed would sojourn as strangers in the land for a time. Thus there would be a length of time before they could enter their possession. At the same time as God gave Abraham the covenant, promising him the land of Canaan in Genesis 15, he also told him how long this time period would be, and what would happen to them during this time. In Genesis 15:13-16, we read that God said to Abram, "Know of a surety that your seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward they will come out with great substance." That's, of course, a prophecy of the Exodus. In the 4th generation they shall come here again, that is, to possess the promised land. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. Now the reason why Abraham's seed could not possess the land for 400 years was that the nations in the promised land were not yet ripe for judgment, for their sin was not yet complete or full. But after the 400 years their sin became full, so that God could then remove them and bring Israel in to possess the land. This time period of 400 years ends with the Exodus, because it says, afterward they shall come out. Thus, at the Exodus, the time was up on the Canaanites, and Israel had the right to possess her land. It is important to notice that this prophecy concerns his seed rather than Abraham himself. It predicts that they will be sojourners in the lands of other nations, but that after the 400 years, God would deliver them, so that they could return to the land as a conquering nation. This was fulfilled at the Exodus, when they became a free, sovereign nation in their own right. The land was theirs, for the Lord had given it to them by covenant. Genesis 15:18, God says, "Unto your seed have I given this land." And now that the 400 years was up, they had the right to take possession of that land. This is a picture. For likewise, God promised to deliver mankind out of slavery and bring us into a great inheritance after 4,000 years. Right on time, he raised up Jesus, the prophet like unto Moses, to bring us out of bondage and bring us into our promised land. If you are in him, you have made your exodus out of Satan's dominion, and now the land of God's promises is yours. It's now up to you to enter in and possess it. Your time in Egypt is over. You have a legal right to possess the land. Take hold of what God has already given you. Enter in boldly and do not shrink back. The part of the verse that says, "and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them," which describes their time of slavery in Egypt, should be seen as a parenthesis. It's in brackets. In other words, it's not implying that the Egyptian bondage will last 400 years, which is impossible. You can check Galatians 3:17 to see that. No, you see, the primary point of the prophecy is to give the total time that the seed will have to wait before they can possess the land. During this time, they will be strangers in other people's lands. The secondary point is that for the latter part of this time, they will come under bondage and affliction to another nation, which was Egypt. But God will judge that nation, and they will escape and return to the land to possess it. Thus there would be 400 years sojourning, which included a time of bondage to Egypt. God indicated how long this bondage would last by saying, "In the 4th generation they shall come here again." This is clearly much shorter than 400 years, which is the total time of the sojourning. Immediately after this prophecy, God promises the land to his seed. That's in Genesis 15:17-21. But first, he needed to outline the whole period of 400 years before they could actually possess it. Stephen referred to these 400 years in Acts 7, verse 5 and 6. Verse 5 says, "He gave him, Abraham, no inheritance in the land, no, not so much as to set his foot on. Yet he promised that he would give it to him for a possession, and to his seed after him, when as yet he had no child." Next, Stephen describes the time that Abraham's seed would have to wait before taking possession of the land, and that's in verse 6. "And God spoke on this wise, that his seed should sojourn in a strange land, and that they should bring them into bondage and entreat them evil for 400 years. Let me point that out again. God said that Abraham's seed should sojourn in a strange land for 400 years. Notice again that these 400 years of sojourning concerns Abraham's seed, not Abraham himself. This time would end when Israel would arise as a nation and inherit her land. That's what we see in the next verse now. "And the nation to whom they shall be in bondage, I shall judge, said God, and after that shall they come forth and serve me in this place." That's Acts 7:7. This describes events at the end of the 400 years when they escape in the Exodus and possess the land. Thus God showed Abraham that his seed would only be able to receive their inheritance after a wait of 400 years. It remains to ask, what event initiated these 400 years? We know that the time from Abraham entering Canaan and receiving the covenant at the age of 75 until the Exodus was exactly 430 years. Since the 400 years also ends with the Exodus, this time span must begin 30 years after he entered the land, when he was 105 years old. Now, since the subject of the prophecy was the seed, the start of this time period must have something to do with Isaac, who was the first seed. Now, Isaac was born when Abraham was 100. We saw that in Genesis 21:5. So this time span began when Isaac was 5 years old. This must be the starting point of the 400 years. Something of great importance in Isaac's life must have happened at this time when he was 5. Indeed, there is an event from Isaac's early childhood that is recorded and given great emphasis in both the Old and the New Testament. We read it in Genesis 21, verse 8-10. "And the child, Isaac, grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast the same day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking. Wherefore she said unto Abraham, Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman," who was Ishmael, "shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac." So 30 years after the covenant was given, Isaac, age 5, was weaned. To wean is the word gamal, which carries a wider force than merely to wean that we have in English. It signifies to deal fully with. It's used in Psalm 13 verse 6. For a child, it covers the whole period of nursing and care until the weaning is complete, so that when it was finished it signified that the child had reached an important point of maturity, so that it was no longer totally dependent on its mother. In ancient times, this period was much longer than now, extending to 3 years or more. Thus the completion of the period marked the end of the most critical stage of the child's life, and so it was celebrated with a feast, a custom that is still observed in the East. Although 5 years was certainly a long weaning time, it is understandable in view of the special attachment that Sarah would have had for her miracle baby, the promised seed, given by God when she was 90, after a lifetime of barrenness. She no doubt was protective, wanting to keep Isaac close. His late weaning could partly explain Ishmael's mocking of Mummy's boy during the celebration. An interesting comparison is that Hannah only handed her miracle baby Samuel to Eli in the house of God when he was weaned. That's 1 Samuel 1:24. He needed to reach a certain level of maturity, well, first to be of any service there, again probably between 4 and 5 years old. The celebration of Isaac's transition from babyhood brought to the surface the crucial issue as to who would inherit and have preeminence, the son of the flesh or the son of the promise, the son of the spirit. Normally, it would fall to the firstborn, that's Ishmael, but Isaac was of Sarah and was specially favored. Ishmael's mocking of Isaac was a manifestation of this struggle as he endeavored to assert dominance and to keep Isaac in his place of inferiority. This is a picture of the battle between the flesh and the spirit. In order for the true seed, the work of the spirit, to be established, the work of the flesh must be cast out. Otherwise it will constantly fight and challenge it. Until this point, Abraham had not officially recognized Isaac as the true seed, the one who would inherit the covenant and all the promises, his only son, as he's described in Genesis 22:2. Therefore, Ishmael, the elder son, still stood in a position to inherit, along with Isaac, even perhaps the major part. Thus, Isaac's inheritance and position as the seed of Abraham was under threat. The mocking by Ishmael made Sarah aware of the necessity of casting out Ishmael from the family and from his position and inheritance, so that Isaac could inherit. Abraham naturally was reluctant, but God agreed with Sarah, saying it was necessary. In Genesis 21:12, God says, "For in Isaac shall your seed be called." So, in verse 14, Abraham sent Ishmael away and acknowledged Isaac as his only heir. He had to make this very hard decision. Ishmael, the seed of the flesh, had to be rejected and cast out in order for Isaac, the seed of promise, to be fully established as the seed and heir of the covenant. As flesh and spirit are opposed, so Ishmael and Isaac were opposed. You must cast out the product of your flesh for the fruit and work of the Spirit to be established in your life. You see, even when you're back in fellowship with God as Abraham was, you may still have an Ishmael in your life, the product of your time in the flesh, that opposes the work of the Spirit in your life. You must make the decision to cast Ishmael out, so that Isaac, that which is brought forth by God's Spirit in your life, so that Isaac can thrive. Otherwise, your attention and your energy will be divided between the two, and Isaac will suffer. Since God and Abraham were in covenant, it was necessary that Abraham came into full agreement with God's will concerning Isaac, for him to be fully ratified as the true seed. Only when that decision was made was Isaac's position fully secured from the competition. Thus this moment was vital in the history of redemption, leading up to the Messiah, the greater seed of Abraham, for it was here that God, through Abraham's agreement, fully established his first seed Isaac as the rightful seed and heir of the covenant. Thus it marked the start of the sojourning of Abraham's seed for 400 years, and Ishmael's mocking marked the start of the affliction of the seed as they sojourned. The importance of this event is further emphasized in Genesis 21 by a revelation to Abraham of a new name of God, El Olam. This revelation took place at that time, just after Ishmael was cast out, and Isaac was established as the seed. Genesis 21:22 says, at that time, immediately after these events took place. And let's read now. Then Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. That's El Olam. That's the first time we see this name of God. This means more than the fact that God is eternal. Olam, translated everlasting, generally means a definite, extended, but long period of time. Thus it is best translated the God of the ages. It reveals God as the Lord of time, who creates and rules over the successive ages of history, bringing his purposes to pass. As Hebrews 1:2 and 11:3 says, God formed the ages of time. He created the ages of time and he governs those ages. This certainly points to God's eternality, because he's the Lord of the ages. He's above and beyond those ages. But primarily it describes the Lord who controls these ages of time, especially when one age ends and the next one begins. Thus, Psalm 90 verse 1 is best translated, from age to age you are God. And then a major key as to how God measures and governs these ages is then given in verse 4. One day is as 1,000 years. The events of Genesis 21 provided a fitting moment for the revelation of El Olam, the Lord of the ages, the one who forms the ages by his word, the one who forms the nature and that governs the duration of these ages by his word, as Hebrews 11:3 says. He's the one. El Olam is the one who rules over dispensational changes. He's the Lord of times and seasons. God was confirming to Abraham that he had made an important act of obedience that moved God's plan forward into a new season, the start of a new period, namely the 400 years of Genesis 15. This is confirmed by Galatians chapter 4, verse 21 to 31, which refers to these events as a type of the change from the age of the Old Covenant law to the age of the New Covenant grace, when the Old Covenant had to be removed for the New Covenant to be established, when the greater than Isaac was established as the seed by his resurrection, along with us who are in him, the children of promise. So Galatians compares the establishment of the new covenant and the casting out of the old covenant to the establishment of Isaac as the promised seed of the Spirit, and the casting out of Isaac as the child of the flesh. It makes a comparison between those two things, and these are major changes of time period. We're now going to trace the chronology of the whole time period from the birth of Abraham up to the Exodus. And the Bible covers this time by looking at the lives of Abraham, and then Isaac, then Jacob, then Joseph, then Moses. And we can actually work out the timings of all the events that took place in this time by measuring them relative to the births of these outstanding individuals that all play an important role in the build-up to the Messiah. And so we will be able to use the scriptures to date a number of other events in relationship to one or more of these lives. And so God uses Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses as it were, the centerpiece of the chronology, and we can date everything relative to their births and their lives. In other words, if you know that an event happened in the 77th year of Jacob's life, and you know when Jacob was born, then you can date that event accurately. We see how our sovereign God works according to a timetable. For example, God had an appointed time for the Exodus, which he revealed 400 years beforehand to Abraham, and which was at the end of the 490-year redemption cycle. At the same time as God gave Abraham the covenant, promising him the land of Canaan in Genesis 15, he also told him how long this time period would be, and what would happen to them during this time. In Genesis 15, 13-16, we read that God said to Abram, "Know of a surety that your seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward they will come out with great substance." That's, of course, a prophecy of the Exodus. "In the 4th generation they shall come here again," that is, to possess the promised land, "for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full." Let's now go through the main events in the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, starting with Abraham. The story of Israel starts with the birth of Abraham. God chose him out of the nations to be the father of his chosen nation, through whom he would reveal his plan of redemption. God had originally spoken to him in Ur of the Chaldeans, and called him to leave his family and to go to Canaan. He left Ur, but he was only partially obedient, for he took his father Terah and Lot with him, and instead of going to Canaan, they settled in Haran, probably because of his father Terah. So, instead of obeying God, although they set out to go to the promised land, they actually stopped and lived in Haran instead. Only years later did Abram obey God's call to go to Canaan. At age 75, Abraham enters the land and receives the covenant, Genesis 12:4. This is the start of the 430 years of Galatians 3:16 and 17, and Exodus 12:40 and 41. 10 years later, at age 85, Ishmael was conceived. That's Genesis 16:13. At age 86, Ishmael was born. Genesis 16:16. At age 99, God appears to Abram as El Shaddai and renamed him Abraham. That's Genesis 17:1. He instituted circumcision, and in that year also Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed. Then, when he was 100, Isaac was born. We read about that in Genesis 17 and Genesis 21, verse 5. At age 105, as we've seen, Isaac was weaned, and Ishmael was cast out. And Isaac was established as the seed and heir, and that's all in Genesis 21. And this was the start of the 400 years of Genesis 15:13-15 and Acts 7:5-7. When Abraham was 137, that's when Sarah died. We read that in Genesis 23, verse 1. It said, "Now Sarah lived 127 years." Sarah was 90 when she bore Isaac. That's Genesis 17:17. So Isaac was 37 when she died. Abraham was 100 when Isaac was born, so he was 137 when Sarah died. When Abraham was 140, Isaac married. Genesis 25:20 says, Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to be his wife. This took place, therefore, 3 years after Sarah's death. When Abraham was 160, that's when the birth of Esau and Jacob took place. We see that in Genesis 25:26. At age 175, Abraham died. Genesis 25:7 says, These are all the years of Abraham's life that he lived, 175 years. Notice the design of God in Abraham's personal chronology, for the major events in his life mostly took place in multiples of 5 years. Thus his life is stamped with the number of grace.